Hello, my name is Vanessa Andreotti. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria in what is known as Canada today. Here in Canada, Indigenous peoples ask us to start with a land acknowledgement. So my first land acknowledgement is that the University of Victoria is located on the lands of the Lakwangan-speaking peoples, the Songhees and the Esquimalt. And we also acknowledge that the Husainich people and other Lakwangan-speaking nations also have a special relationship to that land. But I come from a family of, a mixed heritage family of German and Guarani ancestry. Guarani are indigenous peoples of Brazil, one of the groups of indigenous people in Brazil. And the Guarani land acknowledgement is much, much longer. So it talks about 4 different acknowledgements. The first acknowledgement is the acknowledgement of the land as a living entity, not a property or a resource. The second acknowledgement is the acknowledgement of our ancestors, both those who have come before us and those who are yet to come. So we bring the responsibility that we have towards 7 generations and more into the future. But we also look into the past and we think about what kinds of mistakes have our ancestors made that we keep on reproducing. So that is an invitation for us to say, the buck stops here. In my generation, I need to stop those mistakes. The third acknowledgement from the Guarani people is the acknowledgement that a lot of effort has been necessary for us to be here today. In the case of technology, for example, we acknowledge that the minerals that are needed for the whole energy setup, the networks of the internet, also the minerals of the computer that I'm speaking to you, the screens, they are mined in exploitative contexts. And this has an effect both on the communities and on the land. So the clothes we wear, the food we eat, they're all coming from unsustainable processes that are very violent. And we are here, our privilege to be here today is underwritten by much violence and unsustainability. So we have a responsibility as well to stop the violence when we can. And the last acknowledgement is the acknowledgement that we are all a big family of human and non-human beings that is currently experiencing distress. And this distress and disease comes out of human-induced changes in the cycle of life in the biosphere of the planet that are currently placing other species, but also our own, the Homo sapiens species, on the path of premature extinction. So what I'm going to talk to you today in relationship to education for sustainable development and global citizenship is in this realm and in this context where we're facing major challenges for our current survival on the planet. So the title of the presentation is Climate, and I'm understanding here climate not just as climate and climate change, but climate as everything. So there is the climate around us, there's the climate within us, and this comes from the understanding that what's happening around us is also happening within us. So the forest fires, the floods, and the famines that are going around in the world are also happening within us. Even though we try to numb to that, we still feel it because they are also part of us. We're not separate from nature and we're not separate from each other. So we're feeling everything. So the idea of this presentation is to invite you to think about global citizenship education, ESD education, or whatever you want to call it. Just call it education. What kind of education could help us hold space for all this complexity, help us learn from past mistakes, and open up the possibility of different futures? How can we activate a relational intelligence, the intelligence that knows that we are not separated, to bring ourselves first, and then our students into a different possibility for being, a different possibility for thinking, for feeling, for hoping, for imagining, and for existing differently in the planet. So I will start with a little bit of a story about where I'm coming from with this. So when I started this work about a long time ago, probably 30 years ago, I used a metaphor to invite people to think about different possibilities for seeing and for seeing things differently. So I invited them to imagine a field of corn, to harvest the corns very, very quickly, and to take the husks of the corn out and to put the corn in front of them. And then I presented them with a picture, that is this picture here, and asked them, are your corns similar to the multicolored corn cobs in the picture? And invariably, with some exceptions, most people's corn cobs would be yellow. So I used the metaphor of the yellow corn cob to talk about the colonization of our imagination. So there's a reason why we can only imagine yellow corn cob, because we are only exposed to yellow corn cobs. And there is a political reason for that. We're not going to go there today. We're just going to be thinking about the image of the corn cob as an analogy to how we get attached to a single story of things, single story of progress, development, and civilization that has been spread around the world and imposed through education, that paints a yellow corn cob picture of what education should be, what relationships should be, what faith is, what justice is, what organizations, governance, health, contracts, everything, security should be, and how it really eliminates other possibilities, and how this story, this single story that we have been taught and that we swim in as the fish in the water, this story is detrimental and destructive to the planet and to our own selves, to our own health, and how because it has eliminated the other possibilities, it's very difficult for us to imagine something different. So when we imagine change, generally we imagine a different kind of yellow corn cob, but we can't imagine the multicolored corn cobs that exist in South America. That photo that you saw before is a photo from Peru. So I started here, and I started to look at what kind of education then could help us imagine things differently. And I wrote this paper in 2006 about soft versus critical global citizenship education. So this was the first time that I started to say, okay, there's this option of global citizenship, but there's also this other one. And let's try to have at least two in front of us. So soft global citizenship education is global citizenship education that is focused on inclusion of other people into the corn cob story, into the mainstream. So generally, the global citizenship education that is based on the single story is about development and humanitarian support for other countries, for other nations and other cultures that want inclusion in the story of the yellow corn cob. And then in this story, we understand our privilege as people living in the global south as coming from better education, more merit, hard work. Basically, we see ourselves as superior, like the yellow corn cob has this sense of superiority to other corn cobs that should be painted yellow. Critical GCE comes from a different perspective. It looks at the single story as a violent story. So it looks at historical and systemic violence that sustains the story. So it says, for example, that this progress, development, and the idea of civilization that we have is subsidized by a lot of violence around it, and it hides the violence. So global citizenship education is about surfacing the violence and the externalized costs of our own privileges. In this sense, the solution, this global citizenship would be focused on justice, the debt that we have to other countries because we have either colonized their lands or have unfair trade practices that pull their resources to the global north. And we need more accountability and repair of these relations. And the privilege in this, in critical GCE is a result of control over unjust social structures. So I put these two on the table to start a conversation about the implications and what we would be doing as educators if we were following soft GCE or critical GCE. But this is not this dichotomy is not sufficient for the level of complexity we have today. We have many more types of disease. Some of them are also mapped in an article that I wrote with Dr. Karen Kashby and Sharon Stein around many other different categorizations. If you're interested, I will also send you the link for that. So that was my second thing that I did that really was a landmark in my study of global citizenship education. But there was something else that happened after that in 2012 in response to the CONI 2012 campaign. So CONI was a cult leader, basically, that had a military at his disposal. And he was recruiting child soldiers in the Congo, Uganda, and South Sudan. And then these two very young people decided to create a campaign against CONI in the global north. And what happened there was that the campaign was super oversimplified. It gathered a lot of support, but it was through soft global citizenship, and it created a problem where it was very difficult for educators to bring to the students a more nuanced perspective. So in that context, I created the Heads Up checklist, and this was 2012. And the Heads Up checklist shows patterns of the problematic patterns of engagement between the global north and the global south. So when we're trying to help, this is what generally comes up. If you're coming from the perspective of soft global citizenship or the yellow corn cob. So the first thing that happens is that there is a hegemonic orientation that reinforces and justifies the continuity of the status quo. So we believe that the single story of the corn cob is the only one available, and we want everybody to have access and be included in it. Then there's an ethnocentric projection that presents the story as one view that is universally valid and superior to others. There's also ahistorical thinking that forgets the role of historical legacies such as colonialism and slavery and extraction and complicities in shaping the current problem. So here we see ourselves as only part of the solution, not part of the problem. Then there are depoliticized analyses that disregard the impacts of power inequalities and that delegitimizes dissent. So again, it just wants one single story. Then there are self-serving motivations invested in self-congratulatory heroism, like we are going there to make a difference to them and we gain something out of it, we feel better because of it. And this is what is called the savior complex. And then there are uncomplicated solutions that generally make us feel good, and they're like quick fixes, but that do not address the root causes of the problems. And the last one is paternalistic investments. So we are doing things because we want the communities to say thank you for saving me, and we want this thank you to come from those that we have helped. So all these patterns here, they do not lend themselves to effective global citizenship education because they've reproduced the single story of the corn cob and the colonialism that goes with that. However, when I started using this list, what I noticed was that people wanted to use it as a checklist, and actually it became a checklist. But every time that we were trying to address one of these problems, we created another one. So for example, if I'm trying to address the hegemonic orientation, and sometimes I create another hegemony, another story to replace that, people couldn't work with the complexity of it. And then I started to look at complexity in systems theories to see if there was anything that could help us actually understand that by trying to address one problem, we could create another one. And what I found was very interesting. I found this concept of wicked challenges that became very, very, very useful in my approach to global citizenship. So in systems and complexity sciences, they make a distinction between regular challenges, which are everyday problems with known solutions. Then there are complicated challenges. There are problems requiring specialized expertise. Then there are wicked challenges that are multi-layered, complex, and interlocked problems with no clear solution. And they have larger time scales, and they are characterized by organized irresponsibility. Then there are super wicked challenges, which are wicked, urgent challenges with a short window for action, where those who created the problems are also those proposing the solutions, and where irrational discounting keeps pushing responses into the future. So questions related to power relations between the global north and the global south are wicked challenges. Climate change, wicked challenge. Biodiversity loss, wicked challenge. Inequalities, wicked challenge. Actually, all of these are super wicked challenges. And our system of education doesn't prepare us to deal with wicked or super wicked challenges. It prepares us for a very predictable and stable future where we are acting upon certainties and linear change. And that doesn't work when we're working with global citizenship education, where all these super wicked challenges are there. So what happens when we approach super wicked challenges as if they were regular or complicated challenges is a merry-go-round. So this merry-go-round is a merry-go-round where we look for safe, simplistic, feel-good, look-good solutions that sustain the status quo. When we engage with communities that have been historically and systemically marginalized, we do that in tokenistic, transactional ways, driven by how well we look, by optics, and by consumption of what they have to offer. And we tend to express a narrow and limited imagination of what is possible and what is desirable. So this merry-go-round, when I looked at the merry-go-round, I was thinking, how do we get out of that? And then I looked at our current modern education, because that merry-go-round is created by our current education, and it is a problem. So when I looked at modern education, there was a catch-22 there with 5 common assumptions. The first assumption is that talking about negative things makes people feel demotivated. Negative things like colonialism, for example, racism. Number 2, that complexity and uncertainty make people feel anxious and overwhelmed. So if we're thinking about the magnitude of the climate and nature emergency, that's in there. Number 3, that exposing complicities, how we are part of the problem, makes people feel uncomfortable. Number 4, that lack of simple solutions makes people feel immobilized. They can't act. And number 5, that talking about the possibility for wider social and ecological destabilization can make people feel hopeless, frustrated, and angry. Therefore, we should make it short, should make it simple, should make it easy, light, fun, and hopeful. The problem here is that if we make it short, simple, easy, light, fun, and hopeful, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are going to happen. It's a catch-22, right? Because we're teaching students to expect and demand certainty, coherence, predictability, and control in a world where these things are no longer possible. They never were, but this time they're surfacing in a different way. And we're going to talk a little bit about that now. So there are limits. The limits of modern education is that they are leaving us with all these complexities of the world weighing on our back. So we have personal complexities, intergenerational complexities, historical complexities, systemic complexities weighing us down. And then we're holding on to a stick of unstable certainties to see if we can balance. But the kind of education we need is a kind of education that we can do this movement that puts the complexity in front of us. And for that, we need to develop the muscles and the posture to do that safely. If you are used to lifting weight, you know that there are techniques so that you don't get hurt. And we need to put all these complexities in front of us so that we can process them collectively. We can't, if we just leave them on our back, it will break the back. It will create a mental health issue where you have all these anxieties, depression, and we can't process these feelings anymore. So if we look at how we came to be with all these complexities on our back, we need to look back a little bit and look at what has happened in the last 30 years. And here is just a comparison in relationship to technology. So in 1993, 30 years ago, the World Wide Web became available to the masses, to the public. Before that, it existed in the military and universities, but then it became available to everybody. So think about it. I'm imagining most people who are watching this would have been born after that. And it's very difficult to imagine before 1993 what education looked like. But basically, if I needed any information, I would have to go to a library. If I needed to go somewhere, I needed to have a map. And teachers were really responsible for selecting the content that the students would be exposed to, and they would be exposed just to that content. That's a major, major shift here, right? So when Google then appeared in 1998, instead of the teacher selecting the content, the students, the children were exposed to everything already. So already there with the with Google, with the creation of Google, the authority of teachers shifted immensely, and we still haven't really got our heads around that. So when we are planning our lesson plans, sometimes we think that that's the only thing the students will be exposed to. But actually, instead of offering them like a meal, like we did before the internet, what we need to do as teachers is not necessarily just curate the content, but help people process the information, help people digest things. So it's more like a probiotic education than it is about preparing a meal. Then in 2000, there was a mass adoption of smartphones. Skype was launched in 2003. Facebook was launched in 2004. And with Facebook, something else also shifted that was very important, which is the fact that our social relations now are mostly developed and maintained digitally, right, through social media platforms. And that changes, again, how we relate to each other, how we relate to technology, and how much technology is part of our lives as kind of an extra limb, right? The phone becomes an extra limb to the body. Then we have introduction of iPhones, Instagram launch, and by this time, what we have is that our interactions are also being controlled by algorithms. If you have seen the network experiment on Netflix, you have an idea of how all these social media organizations, they use algorithms to control what we are exposed to. So from the teacher controlling the exposure of content before 93, then it opened up with Google, and then corporations got hold of the control again through the algorithms. 2020, Zoom grew rapidly as a response to the pandemic, and then we had a hybrid learning revolution that also changes the way that education then is received and perceived and created and designed. And in 2022, ChatGPT and other large language models, artificial intelligence, were made publicly available. And we still don't know the implications of having ChatGPT available for teachers or for schools, but we know that things are going to change immensely, because just as Google revolutionized content curation, ChatGPT and other LLMIs will revolutionize content creation. And there are lots and lots of dangers and risks associated with that for humanity, because we have now machines that can learn and that have already got hold of language and how we use language, and they can create intimacies and enter our psyche and our cognitive frames in very different ways. But these technologies can also be used for good. So the idea is not to turn your back to the technologies, but really engage now with another layer of complexity that they bring to the classroom. And we will have to be reimagining even how we approach education in terms of before we were sorting people according to how well they were writing and processing content, and now the machine can do it for them. And we as teachers will have to find another way to appropriated to or to adopt it ethically in what we do. But what I mean to say with this slide is that there were changes in access to information, knowledge production, social relationships, identity building, the sense of belonging, the use of time, attention spans, jobs, health, and well-being. This is all wrapped up in the 30 years of technological advancements. But there were also other advancements that have happened in society in the past 15 years, or other disruptions that increase that level of complexity. The first one in 2008 would be the global financial crisis. Then there was I Don't Know More and Black Lives Matter movements arising in 2013, and then rising again in 2019 with the murder of Floyd. In 2015, we had a movement called Roads Must Fall in South Africa. Here in Canada, we had the launch of the TRC report, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report about how education here in Canada was used until 1996 in cultural genocide. So indigenous kids would be removed from their families and put in residential schools where they would be subject to lots of kinds of abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse. They would test medical tests on these kids and nutritional tests. And if you can imagine, in these schools, the children could not speak their language. And in some schools, they would deprive children of nutrients, of food nutrients, just to see what happens. So all of this came out, and in Canada, we had to grapple with what happened, because most people until then didn't know anything about it. And now we have the survivors of the schools talking about it, and it is estimated that only 50% of the children survived. Then there's the Me Too movement in 2017. 2017 was also the year where we have the world reaches 1% owning 50.1% of the world's wealth. So inequalities are really at a level that they've never been before. School strikes for climate movement started in 2019. The COVID-19 pandemic and public happened in 2020. And also what happened in 2020 here in Canada was that they found, because through the technology that can scan the lands around the residential schools, and they found unmarked graves of children. So they're counting the number of children who were killed in these schools and who died in these schools under very dire circumstances, but they were never reported. So we are at the number right now is more than 10,000 children. So on September the 30th here in Canada, it was Truth and Reconciliation Day, where we remember the children who didn't go home, didn't return home. And this is education. We're talking about education that from the end of the 1800th century until 1996 was trying to do something good for society, let's say, by trying to make to eliminate indigenous people. So that is not just cultural genocide, that is genocide. So Canadian society is having to grapple with genocide. 2022, there's the invasion of Ukraine. In 2023, in June, we had a day where the average global air temperature hit 17.18 centigrades, and it's the hottest day ever recorded. And here I'm not even talking about the wildfires and the floods that are happening everywhere due to climate destabilization. So here we have a call for decolonization, here in Canada, reconciliation, racial justice, equity, end of gun violence, awareness of sexual violence, gender and sexual rights. There's climate action and climate justice. Now, if we think about education, not much has changed. We have all these layers added, all these layers of complexity added. But if you look at teacher education programs, most of us are still doing what we were doing in 1993. A lot of it is still based on preparing teachers and children to the world of the yellow corn cob. And that world is no longer stable, and it is kind of falling apart. So if we're thinking about what's different, really, this is a summary. The first thing is that we live in a chaotic cacophony of perspectives. There's not the possibility of saying, this is the universal answer, or that knowledge works like this. It works in a linear way. No, knowledge, there's many different perspectives, lots of echo chambers, lots of information, but also lots of misinformation, and that creates a problem for education. How do we educate in a sea of information and disinformation? Then there's reactive polarization, and here it's about also how the internet promised us that everybody would be heard, but then when everybody's speaking, nobody has the time really to listen. Our attention span is very short, and when we're not being heard, when we're promised we were going to be heard, we start to shout. And when we start to shout, we start to create these different clusters of people shouting together, and then it creates a polarization. And we have never seen the level of polarization that we see today before. Then there's semantic proliferation, but also word policing and discursive confusion. So this means that people have learned to use language in a different way, and that words now are more like entities. They have multiple layers of meaning. They are used in different ways, and it's very difficult to figure out a way that we're speaking the same language and meaning the same thing. This is kind of impossible because of the many layers of meaning. And for some, this could be a good thing, that we are getting out of the prison of the dictionary and using things in more creative ways, because language is something alive, it's something that changes with time, and sometimes the dictionary makes it more difficult. But there's also word policing. Now we have groups telling each other not to use this word or that word, and now people are afraid of the words they are going to say, because you might be canceled if you say the wrong thing too. So there's a lot of discursive confusion. Then there are multiple moving layers of complexity. Complexity is exponentially rising. There's unprocessed hyperconsumption. So the way we engage with the world is very consumptive. So we don't consume only stuff, we consume relationships, we consume experience, we consume knowledge, we consume critique, but we don't digest it. It stays here in a big constipation. Then there's a general lack of capacity to process contradictory emotions. We have a global mental health crisis with a lot of anxiety, depression, and self-harm rising amongst young people, but also across generations. And this processing of the emotions individually is very difficult. We need to do it collectively, but then because of technology, we don't have the time also to do it. Number 7, there's an excess of delicious distractions and incentives for numbing. So we can numb to what's happening around us by consuming or by just being distracted, really. But that doesn't work all the time. And the more you numb, then when you unnumb, you're going to feel everything, right? So here we're talking about how education could help that people process their feelings so that they can stay with reality. Because if we're numbing to reality, we're going to try to escape into an idealization of reality that then becomes problematic in itself. Then there are echo chambers in the individual creation of reality. So in these pockets and communities that are only talking to themselves, you create this illusion that you can create the reality that you're living in, forgetting the material reality that we share, which is the planet. So we have the post-truth situation that is very, very dangerous and that can rig elections everywhere. Then we have wider intergenerational gaps. So if we're thinking about intergenerational gaps before, it would be like we're speaking across 20 years between generations. But now, because of the technology and all this rapid change, it's like 100 years. So we have, for example, people who were born after the Second World War, the baby boomers. If they have to talk to Gen Z, who are the people who are coming into universities now, there is a very real sense of a disconnect. And there's sometimes resentment and entrenchment of positions. So multi-generational conversations require a different kind of container. And 10, there are unclear content creation AI implications. So we are worried about the implications of AI and how it's proliferating very, very quickly and in an unchecked way. And we don't know what's going to happen as a result of that. And again, we go back to education. How has education changed? Are we addressing all these things, or are we just trying or using books that were created for a different time and for a different world that they don't work in the same way anymore? And the question is, how do we prepare then our teachers, and how we prepare our students for a very different reality? So one thing that I would like to say is that this is a slide that I use with my teacher educators and the teacher education candidates, is that that asks what kind of education is needed. And we need education that prepares us to do 4 things. 1, to expect change and be prepared to dance with change, giving you flexibility to think on your feet and adaptability to respond gracefully to shifting grounds in your profession and in society. We also need education that expands our capacity to hold space for difficult things without feeling overwhelmed and immobilized. We need to develop the stamina and resilience for the long haul of this work. We need to embrace our training and professional knowledge and identify as a lifelong, we need to embrace our training and professional knowledge and identity as a lifelong and life-wide inquiry, approaching things with curiosity rather than the desire for certainty, seeing both success, mistakes, and failure as good data. And number 4, we need to invite a different neurochemistry into teaching and learning. Instead of this dopamine-based achievement model, we need to embrace uncertainty and find the heights of depth and epiphanies in learning and unlearning collectively and collaboratively. And this is a very different neurochemical setup for education. So when I was looking at that, I was also working with indigenous communities in the Global South, especially in the Amazon. And I was looking at what their education was. And my first question when I started this project 10 years ago was to understand how indigenous people in the Amazon, the Honikui people, would educate a baby to stay in the struggle to protect the Amazon forest. So imagine that when this baby is born in the Amazon, you have the government trying to kill it, basically, right? So it's not, especially the Bolsonaro government at that time was saying that indigenous people who just want to live in the forest shouldn't exist. They should just assimilate into the yellow corn cob. And he was actually emboldening people, the land grabbers, to kill people. And this has happened, that children have been killed as a result of that. Then this child will have to fight mining companies. It will have to fight land grabbers. It will have to fight for their lives as part of the forest in the context of climate change. So it's this child is born to fight, basically, right? And my question is, what kind of education creates that resilience and that courage to stay in the struggle? So I started asking them, what's the difference between Western education and their education? And I started to take inspiration from that. So they told me that modern education is education of the head, and we expect the body and the behavior to follow once the head has been educated. In their perspective, their Hunikui indigenous education, they said to me they were educating the gut for the heart to be filled so that the head can follow. So it's a very different understanding of education. They also said that modern education is a question of information. It's a task focused on information, whereas Hunikui education is an intellectual, emotional, and relational, lifelong and life-wide co-inquiry with the rest of nature, because you don't see yourself as separated from nature. So it's always inquiry. It's not based on certainty. So from this inspiration, I created, with my research collective, we created a distinction between mastery education, which is modern education, and depth education, which is a different kind of modern education too, but that takes us to the limit and beyond modernity. So mastery education is education like the kind of education we have in schools, that we put content in a cup in the hand of the student, and then we measure it and we give it a grade. It's also like connected to the sense of conquering something, mastering concepts, mastering skills, conquering a mountain, conquering a peak, and getting the dopamine when you get there. And it's based on description and prescription. So you either force feed the content, or you say to the student, here's a buffet that I curated for you. You choose from this buffet, and it's learner-centered. So it's teacher-centered when you force feed, or when you give the buffet to the children and students, they choose it, but you selected it, right? So this is one type of education, master education. The other type, which is depth education, is where you're peeling the layers, like peeling the layers of an onion, and crying in the process, and making a meal with a lot of different people. Think about a truckload of onions, all the complexities there. We have to process and to digest them. It's, instead of conquering a peak, it's like deep diving in a freezing ocean to understand that our bodies are water. The water that we're diving in is also part of our bodies, and we're also, all the stuff we put in the water that makes it unlivable for the creatures of the water and makes it undrinkable for ourselves. So this is the kind of education about inquiry, insight, hindsight, and foresight. That's why I call it probiotic education, that helps us process both the information and misinformation around us, but also the complex emotions we have within us. So depth education is trying to address 4 denials. So depth education is not about just giving people information. So the problem is not one of ignorance. If it's ignorance, we just give the information, the problem is solved. If the problem is denial, our denial, then if you give the information, they shoot the messenger, right? So when you're trying to educate to address denial, you have to bypass the defenses of the ego. So here are the 4 denials that animate depth education, that depth education is trying to interrupt. The first is the denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm. The fact that our comfort, securities, and enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation. They happen at the expense of other people, of other species, and of the land. The second is the denial of the limits of the planet. The fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption indefinitely. The third is the denial of entanglement. Our insistence in seeing ourselves as separate from each other and from the land, rather than entangled within a living wider metabolism that is biointelligent. And the fourth is the denial of the magnitude and complexity of the challenges we will need to face together. The tendency to look for simplistic solutions that make us feel and look good, and that may address symptoms but not the root causes of our collective hypercomplex predicament. So depth education, we started with 2 questions, but now we have 5. So I'll show you the first 2 first. The first question was, what kind of education can help us build the intellectual, affective, emotional, and relational muscles that can collectively enable us to face the complexity of multiple realities, to learn from past and ongoing mistakes, and to open up the possibility for different futures to emerge? How can we learn to do the kindest and most responsible thing to each other and to the land at all times, especially in times of crisis and polarization. So these two questions that were the questions where we started could be the questions for ESD, for global citizenship education, or for just education. That I think that's where we are, where global citizenship education is just education. Here are the three questions that emerged as we started to use that education. What if we knew in our skin, flesh, and bones, not just in the head, if we knew in the gut, that major, wider social and ecological collapse is inevitably in the horizon, and that in 10 to 20 years or less, what is familiar will no longer be viable because we have crossed 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries. And here I'm referring to the work of the Stockholm Resilience Institute. Number 4, what if we could collectively respond today from a cultural space of emotional serenity, relational maturity, intellectual discernment, and intergenerational responsibility, which we call SMDR. And number 5, what would you or we be doing? What would we be teaching or advocating for then? And when the children born today look back 30 years from now, what actions would they be grateful that we took right now? So when we look at education, I think number 4 is where I would like to focus on. So the idea that collectively we could move ourselves as humanity to a place of engaging with the world from a space of emotional serenity, relational maturity, intellectual discernment, and intergenerational responsibility. So how do we start to do that? In depth education, we have been trying several different things, but generally we come back to the fact that we cannot address the complexity outside of us if we don't address the complexity within first. So we start by learning to hold space for our internal complexity first. And in that sense, we invite people to imagine they are a bus or any other image that depicts plurality, but the bus is really good. So imagine you're a bus, that there's a person driving and there are lots of passengers. Passengers at the front who you know very well, passengers in the middle who talk sometimes, and passengers at the back who you do not even know. And there are multiple layers of this bus, but we're going to focus on this one. And we ask people to observe the different responses they have, the different emotions they have, the different thoughts and the different feelings. And we ask people to observe their passengers. So in this methodology, you could say, when you're doing a group debrief, for example, that what's happening on your bus, and you can say one passenger is saying one thing, another passenger is saying another. There is a discussion about something here, and we encourage you to be thinking about how old are these passengers? Are they speaking from fear, from trauma? Do they sound like somebody you know? Do they want things to be black and white? Do they trust the driver? So all these questions create a vocabulary for us to process complex thoughts and emotions. And if we can't process it for ourselves, again, we won't be able to process it outside of us. So that's one of the ways of putting this complexity in front of us. So I will invite you to look at this metaphor of the bus. And with this metaphor, I will tell you a story that comes from depth education that exemplifies what we do. And as I tell you the story, I will invite you to observe your passengers, observe the activated passengers on your bus. So observe the discussions that happen. So the story is not about you agree or don't agree with the story. The story is about what are your what is it provoking on your bus? What are your passengers saying? And this is the story of the house of modernity, the house that modernity built. This is another way to talk about the yellow corn cob, the single story of the yellow corn cob. And the story has 4 different parts. The first part is the first frame that is over there. I'm going to put it larger so that you can see it. So the first frame is about a house sitting on a planet, but the house is exceeding the limits of the planet. It's overshooting the planetary boundaries. And the house has a foundation of separation, of separability, separation of humans from nature. So for you to live in the house, you have to believe that humans are superior to all the other species, and they are they're separate from the land. In this story of separability, this is what creates hierarchies of value, the rankings of species, the rankings of culture, the rankings of human beings against each other. There are also two carrying walls of this house. One carrying wall is the carrying wall of the nation state. The other carrying wall is the carrying wall of universal reason. So the carrying wall of the nation state is about the nation state being created to protect property and capital. So when we think about the nation state as protecting people, generally the protection of people only happens when the protection of people is also about the protection of capital. In the universal reason story, carrying wall is the single story of progress, development, and civilization that kills the other stories. Then we have a roof of global capital that today is not industrial capitalism, it is speculative shareholder algorithmic capitalism that is very different, and it's kind of anonymous. It works on its own. It's an artificial intelligence in itself because it's controlled by algorithms. And this roof is structurally damaged because it only looks at profit, and because it is anonymized and based on AI, we lose track of the responsibility, the economic responsibilities as well. So that's the first frame. The second frame talks about the hidden costs of the house. Inside the house, we have unsustainable growth and overconsumption, and then we have an arrow of expropriation of things and resources, so-called resources from the planet into the house, and then we have waste disposal from the house into the planet. And in the planet, we have dispossession, destitution, genocides, and ecocides. And here in this frame, what's underlined is that this house is subsidized and maintained by violence. Then we have the floors of the house. At the top, we have the north of the north, people who have had discretionary income for a long time. We have the celebrities over there and people with a lot of money. And then we have the north of the south in the middle of the house, people who are interested in getting to the north of the north through the stairs of social mobility. And we have the south of the north in the basement of the house, of people who don't have access to social mobility, but want the security of the house still around them. And then we have the south of the south, where people who are outside of the house, but receiving all the sewage of the house and trying to fight for a different form of existence. And here I put the Hunikui people, the indigenous people of the Amazon, who are fighting against carbon trading, for example, saying that we should not financialize our forests, that this is a scam, that we're just giving license for people to pollute more in other places, and that they want to live as part of the forest as their ancestors have lived before. But with all the sewage coming in, all the pressures for deforestation in the Amazon, and for opening the Amazon to all these predatory industries, they have to put their lives on the line to protect that biome on behalf of all of us. Because if the Amazon forest goes, even 5% more deforestation, it will automatically, like there is a tipping point where it on its own, it becomes a desert with only 5% more deforestation. And once it becomes a desert, instead of being a carbon sink, it will become a carbon source. And then climate destabilization is going to accelerate exponentially. So here in this frame, we have the house, all these divisions talking about the false promise of universal middle class. So here, the invitation is for you to think that if even the working class of Europe, right, if that pattern of consumption and of living, that lifestyle was spread to the whole planet, we would need at least four different planets to survive, to guarantee our future. So we're definitely consuming more than our fair share, and we're externalizing the costs of these consumptions to the global south. In the last frame, we have climate change, economic instability, cancellation of rights, precarity, populism, all putting pressure on the roof. And then inside the house, we have social, economic, political, mental health crisis. And in the planet, we see violent conflict and mass and forced migration. So here we ask, do we fix this house, do we expand this house, do we build another house, do we live without a house, do we find more planets? And the point here is that, again, this is not about whether you agree or disagree, but it's about what kinds of responses do you see activated on your bus. But when we get to the question of what to do with the house, it's important also to talk about three types of responses. There's the response that asks for soft reform, that wants to just extend the house or put some cement there. And sometimes in this response, you get that we need just to close the door of the house and put the military in our borders and not let anybody else to come in. But it wants to keep the house. So more modernity, same forward, same leadership, small changes. Radical reform is still like, we want the house to be there, but we want to open it up to more people. We want different leadership. We want larger changes. And there are people who think in beyond reform. So in beyond reform, more of the house, more modernity is not an option, given the violence required and the limits of the planet. So here we ask different questions, different answers. So my invitation is for you to see which passengers on your bus are arguing for soft reform, which passengers are arguing for radical reform, which passengers are arguing for beyond reform. So these are just examples of what we do in depth education. It is very different from just imparting information. It requires a lot of affective engagement and cognitive engagement that is different from the kind of education we're used to. And in order just to wrap it up, what I'll share with you are it's an invitation for 7 steps back and 7 steps forward. And this invitation is, I think it summarizes what depth education is trying to do. So here you go. There's invitations for 7 steps back, and where you invite people to step back from one's self-image, to decenter the ego and center the challenges at hand, to step back from one's generational cohort, to have a sense of how incoming generations may interpret and experience the challenges differently. Then there's stepping back from the universalization of our social, culture, economic parameters of normality, which is the yellow corn cob, to understand what's privilege as also a loss of perspective and sensibility. Number 4 is stepping back from the immediate context and time that we find ourselves to see wider historical, structure, and systemic patterns. Number 5 is stepping back from normalized patterns of problem posing, problem solving, and relationship building to tap other possibilities that are already there, but they are unimaginable or unintelligible for the yellow corn cob. Then we have stepping back from the elevation of humanity above the rest of nature to consider that we are entangled with the metabolism of the planet, and the harm that we do to the planet, to other species, to the land, is harm that we do to ourselves. Number 7 is stepping back from the impulse to find quick fixes, quick solutions, in order to expand our capacity not to be immobilized by complexity, and uncertainty. Then we have 7 invitations for 7 steps forward or aside. The first one is stepping forward or aside with honesty and courage to see what you don't want to see. The second is stepping forward or aside with humility to find strength in openness and vulnerability. The third is stepping forward or aside with self-reflexivity so that you can read how you're being read and learn to read the room. Number 4 is stepping forward or aside with self-discipline to do the work on yourself so that you don't become work for other people. Number 5 is stepping forward or aside with maturity to do what is needed that rather than only what you want to do, to become a good elder and ancestor for all relations. Number 6 is stepping forward or aside with expanding discernment and attention, increasing care in proportion to risk. And number 7 is stepping forward or aside with adaptability, flexibility, stamina, and resilience for the long haul. And be prepared to fall, to fail, to have your plans shattered, to be stretched, to change course, and to find joy in the struggle itself, rather than in the imagined prize at the end. So we believe that the 7 steps forward, 7 steps back and 7 steps forward could place us in a very different space to collectively process all these complexities and find a different way of living and coexisting together in face of the enormous challenges we have before us. So here, thank you. Here are 3 resources that are available. I'll just talk for a minute about that. There's a book called Hospice in Modernity that I wrote together about the work of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective. There's a report called Moving with Storms, which is a report of an interdisciplinary program that was run at the University of British Columbia, where I was before, that talks about bringing people together to face the climate and nature emergency. And we also have a course called Facing Human Wrongs that is available to everybody. Anybody can do it at the University of Victoria. It's a 6-week course that really goes deeper into depth education and invites you to try it in many different ways that we really advise educators who are interested in that to do it first on themselves. You cannot do depth education in your practice if you haven't yet done it for yourself. And what this course tries to do is to raise the emotional threshold so that we can stay with reality, we can stay with what's difficult, with what's painful, without falling apart and without having relationships falling apart and without feeling immobilized or overwhelmed. So for me, this is the only education that is important right now, as in the sense of what could help us shift course and address the problems that we have to face right now with more emotional sobriety, relational maturity, intellectual discernment, and intergenerational accountability or responsibility. And I hope that you have been touched by the need for us to grow up, for Western society, for modern society to grow up before it's too late. We are already on a path of difficulty with both the climate and nature, the biosphere. We cannot just think about the climate. The climate is one of the problems. We have many different, it's a mega storm, and education has been the problem, has contributed to the storm, but it can also be something that helps us figure out how to get out of the mess that we're in. So thank you.